It's the one you all keep asking for. Hello everybody and welcome back. I'm Miss McCombie and today we're going to be talking about Higher RUAE. I'm going to cover most of the main question types in just this one video instead of making separate videos because really, there's not that much of a difference between Nat 5 and Higher, but I will tell you everything you need to know. The only question type I'm not going to cover in this video is the 5-mark question. That's the last question. I'm going to make a separate video about that. So without further ado, let's get into it. It's so hot, I shouldn't have worn a jumper. So Higher and Nat 5 RUAE are the same in principle. It's still paper 1, the first exam you will sit on that day. You have to read an unseen passage and you have to then answer the questions, and it is worth 30 marks still. However, even though they still look the same, there are some notable differences. So you get 90 minutes to answer the questions, but in that time you have to read 2 passages. The last question is always the 5-mark comparison question, which compares those 2 passages. The wording of the passage and the questions are notably more challenging, and crucially, you do not get any marks for correct quotations, so that means your marks have to come from analysis alone. It's not impossible to do well at Higher, you just have to really put in the work to do well at Higher. Alright, part 2 then. We are moving on to the question types and we're going to start off with the big one, and that is own words questions. In all honesty, there's really not much of a difference between own words at Nat 5 and Higher. You still have to find the information and you still have to put it in your own words. Remember to write in bullet points, 1 bullet point for each number of marks available for that question. I encourage you to highlight or underline the points in the text so that you can find your answers more easily. Remember, you can write on the exam paper. The key difference here is the level of difficulty. The Higher paper is undoubtedly harder, and the reason people find it difficult is because their reading comprehension just simply isn't good enough. You need to read things that are really challenging, and you need to build up your vocabulary and your knowledge of more uncommon language. A suggestion I often give to pupils is to read articles written by Marina Hyde in The Guardian. The language in them is quite dense and so therefore quite challenging to read, and so that makes them particularly good for practice. I'll link to an article of hers down in the description. See if you can understand exactly what she's trying to say in each paragraph. Do you think you could put her main points into your own words? Look at this one about the all-female space flight, for example. She writes, "But look, it's great that we're valorising emotions above all things, because it gives me permission to say how much I hated this entire hilariously vacuous spectacle." If you were in the exam, would you know what words like valorising and vacuous mean? Would you be able to use the context to guess? Well, to valorise something means to give value to it, so she's saying she's glad that in this scenario the women are giving value to emotions. Vacuous means mindless, or having a lack of intelligence, like there being a vacuum. We can sum up this point then by saying something like, she's pleased the focus is on feelings because it means she can describe her strong feelings of dislike for the spaceflight, which she feels suggests a lack of intelligence from the participants. However difficult you find it, persevere. Look up words you don't know. Ask other people what they think. Continue to work at it. It's the only way that you are going to get better. Next, we're going to do developing an argument questions. These are essentially linked questions by another name. You can even use the same structure for answering them. For those who don't know, the structure I like to use is this. You quote the word or phrase that links backwards, and then you summarise what it was talking about before, and then you quote the word or phrase that links forward, and you summarise what it's talking about in the next section. Because you don't get marks for quotes at Higher, you have to link both forward and back to get the full amount of marks. A bizarre amount of people link the wrong way, but I don't really know how to fix it other than by telling you to check carefully. It links back to what happened previously, it links forward to what's coming next. Something else you can comment on, particularly at Higher, is a change in direction. So words like however and but mark a change in direction of the argument. So you could also lay out your answer like this. The word however or the word but or something like that marks a change in direction away from the previous section where they discussed this to talking about this. These really are not as hard as they seem, and they also don't come up as regularly as they do at Nat 5. So at Nat 5 you generally get 1 per paper. At Higher they don't come up that often at all. Just remember, if it says develops the writer's argument, it's just an easy peasy link question by a different name. Alright, next we're going to talk about analysis questions in general. I'm not going to go into detail about all of the individual question types because in the main they're like National 5, only harder, and otherwise we'll be here all day. What I do want to highlight to you is that while quote and explain is fine for National 5, for Higher you're much better off trying to use TQAL. For those of you who aren't familiar, it stands for Technique, Quotation, Analysis and Link. You write what techniques are being used, Then you write down your quote and try not to make it too long. Then you analyse your technique and explain why it's effective. So if it's word choice, you'd be talking about your connotations. For imagery, you use your just as, so too, stuff like that. The link is where you actually answer the question and make sure that everything you've said ties back to what they've asked. Okay, let's look at an example then. So for example, the question asks you, by referring to at least one example, analyse how the writer uses imagery to convey the difficulty in conducting internet research. Now remember, you don't get marks for quoting at Higher. Instead, you get 1 mark for basic comments and 2 marks for detailed and insightful comments. Note that the SQA very rarely gives out marks for detailed and insightful comments, so really assume that all of your answers will count as basic comments. This means that you need to write the same number of TQALs as the number of marks available. If the question is worth 4 marks, you should be aiming to write 4 TQALs. That's a lot of writing, so it's time to build up those hand muscles while you've still got the time. You should also note where questions ask you to comment on more than one technique. So for Higher, if it says and, you need to comment on both techniques, so it could be imagery and sentence structure. You don't have to do that in equal measure. So if the question was worth 4 marks and they wanted you to comment on word choice and sentence structure, you would have to write 4 TQALs, but you could do 2 about word choice and 2 about sentence structure, or you could do 3 of one and 1 of the other. If the question says or, you can comment on either one or the other, and if the question says and or, you get to choose. So read the question carefully, people. Now let's look back at our question. It asks us specifically about imagery and it's worth 2 marks. So that means we need to write 2 TQALs to get 2 full marks. The passage looks like this. It says, it's fair to say that the internet is an ocean of information. Sometimes finding factually correct information amongst the AI-generated answers and angry Reddit rants is like trying to find a black cat on a dark night. We are looking for 2 examples of imagery so we can do our 2 TQALs. Can you spot them? Okay, here's your first one. The internet is an ocean of information. And here is your second one. For our example, we're just going to focus on the first one, but we will come back to the second one in a bit. So let's look at our first example. Well, that is a metaphor. So as your technique, you would write down metaphor. Then you write down your quote, the internet is an ocean of information. And then in your analysis, you can use your just as, so too, like we would at National 5. So just as an ocean is vast and wide and deep, so too is the internet enormous and full of information. And then you use your link to answer the question. So this suggests that accurate internet research is difficult because the internet is so vast and full of information. You might want to use some of the words of the question in your answer. Okay, that would be enough to get you 1 mark for a basic comment. Now, for our second example, why don't you pause the video and see if you can write down an answer, and I'll show you an example answer for it in a second. Okay, please note that what I'm doing here is not best practice. When you do the square brackets with a ... in the middle, it means that the sentence can still make sense without the part that you've taken out of it. I only did that because I was running out of space on the board. Make sure that if you're quoting an example, you're quoting the whole example. I will talk about this a bit more in the top tips. Okay, here, because we're doing imagery, we're using just as, so too, but for the other techniques, you can use like the connotations or whatever you would have used at National 5, you would use in your analysis here. Would it be me if I didn't make a mistake as I was writing it out? You did not need the second is. What do you think? Does your answer look something like this? Righty then, to sum this section up, try to use TQALs, do the same number of TQALs as marks available, read the question carefully. That's all I want to say about analysis questions in general. If you want more detail, you can have a look back at my Nat 5 RUAE videos, just try and use TQAL. The only analysis question I really want to focus on is the tone question. Tone questions don't come up all the time at National 5, but they do come up in almost every higher paper, usually question 8 if you are interested. Remember that tone itself is not a technique, other techniques help to create the tone, so it's kind of like a language question. The other big difference at higher is that they tell you what the tone is. So it's kind of like a use of language question where you need to explain how that particular tone was created. Again, to answer this one, use the same number of TQALs as the number of marks available. Write down whatever technique helps to create that tone, quote it, analyse it, and then in the link write, this creates a, and then the tone in the question, tone because, and then answer the question. Side note, twice now they've asked about an inspirational tone. Don't think it's important, just thought it was interesting. So here's an example then. The technique would be repetition. Our quote is the repetition of the word slowly. I should have quoted the whole section from the passage, but I didn't have the article in front of me at the time that I wrote it. My bad. Try and put as much of the quote as you can in. And then the repetition emphasises just how slowly the action happens in what is meant to be an exciting action film. And then if our question asks about a tone of disappointment, you'd say, this creates a disappointed tone because the repetition makes what should be an exciting action-filled sequence seem slow, boring, repetitive. So that would be enough for 1 mark for a basic comment. If the questions were 2 marks, you would do another TQAL. That's a lot of writing. Like I said, you got to build up those hand muscles.
Don't make the rules.
And that takes us on to part 6, evaluation or effectiveness questions. Dare I say that these don't really come up? At Nat 5, you can kind of rely on an effective conclusion question or sometimes an effective introduction question, but I really haven't seen these in the higher paper for a while. None of the past papers on the SQA website have them. Don't rule them out, but also I don't think we really need to worry that much about them. If they do come up, they can come up in the form of an effective introduction question, an effective conclusion question, or an effective title question. Again, the TQAL works best here. In your link, start with this is effective because. If it's an effective title or an introduction question, they'll probably want you to comment on a technique. If it's an effective conclusion question, it's generally a giant link question. Find a quote that emphasises a point made earlier and explain why it's effective. Like I say, I really don't see this question a lot, so I wouldn't worry about it. Question 8 is generally the tone question. Question 9 is generally the 5-mark question. So there's not really a space for an effective conclusion question. I don't know. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just remember to explain why it's effective. Okay, home stretch. We're on to some top tips. My first tip is obvious. Read. Read more. Read harder things. Read more regularly and start now. Don't say that, oh, well, I'll do it when it comes to revision time. Just start reading now, please, people. Okay, my second tip is to learn to prioritise. You really don't have much time. You have the same amount of time as you had at National 5 to do twice the amount of work. But remember, you can do the questions in any order so long as you number them clearly. Prioritise the questions you can do first. Is the question worth 4 marks but you can only find 3 TQALs? Prioritise marks, leave a gap, move on, come back to it later. You could even put a star or something so you know to come back to it. Don't dwell, don't panic, move on and come back. This next one's kind of a weird one, but I've noticed more people writing like the first 2 and last 2 words of a giant sentence and making that their quote. If you do that, it's not clear what part of the sentence you're focusing on, and so you probably won't get the marks. Some people then go on to say the word X or the phrase Y suggests. And if you do that, what was the point in writing out the giant sentence? Why not make that your quote? It would save you time. If you make your quotes too long, you're probably not going to get any marks for it. So stop hedging your bets, have some conviction. You get better at it with practice. And remember where I used the little square brackets with the ... Yeah, avoid doing that where you can. If you know how to use it properly and the sentence still makes sense and it still has all of the information needed for your quote, then fine. But do as I say, not as I do. This leads me on to my next one. Do not quote at all for own words questions. It infuriates me when people take the time to write out the whole quote and then below that put it in your own words. You do not have the time for that. Just write down the answer. We don't need to know what it was you're putting into your own words. We know what that is. We've read the paper. So please just write down your answers. Okay, so that brings me on to tip number 5. You need to know what your techniques are. By the time you get to higher, you really should be able to identify techniques. And a lot of people tell me they can't do TQAL because they're not sure what the techniques are. I'm sorry, but you kind of need to know this in order to get through higher. Like, I would sit down at the start of the year, make a list of all the techniques you should know, write down the definition and an example, and look back at this regularly. The SQA expects you to be able to comment on techniques. If you really can't think of a technique in the heat of the exam, but you can still analyse it, that's fine, but really try not to make a habit of it. Sometimes the quotes you pick have multiple techniques in them as well, and that's okay. You can comment on both if they're relevant to your analysis. But please, know what your techniques are. And finally, tip number 6, practice as much as you can. It's kind of hard for higher to create papers. You'll find that out when I do my 5-mark question video, because for higher you need 2 passages that are similar. That means that there aren't as many papers just kicking about for you to practice with. So don't even limit yourself to past papers. Read articles for yourself. Identify techniques that have been used. What effect do they have? What do you think the question would be? Try and create sections of your own papers and marking schemes, and then you can use that to test your friends. So practice as much as you can. Start as soon as you can, but don't rely just on past papers. There's other things that you can do. Okay, that's everything I have about Higher RUAE. I hope that's been of some use to you. If you found it helpful, if you could give this video a like. If you have any questions that I've not answered, if you put them down in the comments, I will try and get back to you when I can. Keep an eye out for my 5-mark question video. Hopefully that'll be coming soon. And I'll see you next time. Bye! Just know that while I was trying to do voiceovers, she was on my lap like this the whole time. She's so happy.